So violent crime remains a worrying issue in the country. This has led to many South Africans choosing to legally arm themselves due to the high crime rate and escalating threats of violence in the communities. And sometimes they also do this illegally. There's also been concern about the proliferation of illegal firearms. During Operation Shanyela, nearly 800 firearms had been confiscated by the police. Let's now bring in criminologist Dr. Guy Lamb, who is from the Stellenbosch University, to speak to us about this incident. Of course, he is a criminologist looking at these incidents relating to illegal firearms, as well as just how many individual private citizens are also looking to own a firearm to try and protect themselves. Dr. Lamb, good morning. Thank you so much for making time for us. What are the major concerns when it comes to crime and also private individuals deciding to arm themselves and sometimes doing so illegally?
Well, I mean, the situation we have in South Africa is we have been having an escalating violent crime rate, certainly for the past 10 years. And this issue of, South Africans looking to arm themselves because they feel unsafe is also nothing new. It's been going on for many, many years. We have legislation that makes provision for this. So certainly if you're 21 years or older and you meet certain criteria and you pass certain competency tests, then you are certainly eligible to get a legal firearm. That process is quite lengthy and it's quite complicated, but the sort of situation in terms of the law is you can certainly have in law the ability to apply for a legal firearm. So individuals are driven by this because of concerns, feeling unsafe, feeling that the police can't protect them adequately, the sort of concerns about what if someone breaks into my house, what if someone kind of robs me on the street, what if someone hijacks me, I need to be able to protect myself. So this has been seen as obviously a kind of a key driver of the need for firearms. So we do see, more than about 100,000 firearm applications each year. We have about sort of 3,000, licensed firearms within South Africa. That's the most recent data we have. So it is certainly something that South Africans take into consideration, but not all South Africans. We have a population of more than 60 million and about 3 million are kind of sought to go with kind of apply for legal firearms.
Yeah. So what is it about the process then to try and acquire a firearm legally that makes it so cumbersome that some people then decide that actually let me go and get it from the black market?
Well, I mean, the situation in terms of the legislation changed about 24 years ago because it was quite easy to get a licensed firearm before that. You could be 16 years or older. You could pretty much walk into a gun shop, apply for the process there and walk out with a gun. And then the sort of admin process would take take a couple of weeks, and then you'd get your firearm, sometimes a bit longer. And there were concerns around this easy access was leading to a lot of firearms entering the illegal markets, through loss and theft and negligence. And so the firearm law changed. So it made it a lot more difficult for South Africans to acquire firearm licenses. So you have to be 21 years or older. You go through a background check, which the police do. You have to kind of demonstrate that you don't have a criminal record, that you're not, kind of addicted to drugs or alcohol. You don't have a history of violence. Also, you have to have a safe in your home that's SABS approved, and then you have to go through a competency test. So the process is time consuming. It takes about 90 days for the police to process it. Also, for individuals who are seeking firearms for self-protection, self-defense, you have to provide quite a compelling written motivation to the police. And the police typically, if they feel that your motivation is insufficient or you're living in an area with, doesn't have particularly high crime rates, they often do reject that application. And then you see firearm owners going to the appeals board or to kind of take this forward or kind of bringing in lawyers to assist them in getting their application. So it can, and sometimes in order to delay, sometimes it can take years to get a firearm license.
Yeah. Do you think that there's also this push to try and get a firearm because of the proposal that was once made around gun control, the Firearm Controls Amendment Bill, to do away with self-protection as a reason why you want a firearm?
I think absolutely. I mean, it's also that consideration, but also the concern that South Africa is getting less safe. Certainly seen an increase in the murder rate substantially over the past 10 years. sort of concerns around police effectiveness, police corruption. But also, the state has said they're, wanting to amend the legislation because they're concerned that firearms for self-defense, self-protection are the most at risk of being lost and stolen, and they want to hence remove that provision. And of course, it was pushback from many firearm groups, and as a result, owners, prospective owners, those who want to own a firearm have, been applying because they are concerned that at some point the state may remove this particular provision from law.
Yeah, and here's the thing about it is that while the state is arguing that private citizens owning firearms also leads to more firearms being lost, and of course this then ends up with criminals, is that police officers themselves are also losing their firearms, and sometimes we see that even police stations have become targets of criminals.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the source of most illegal weapons within South Africa at the moment, certainly over the past 20 years, it's largely been internal. So you've seen, individual firearm owners getting targeted, and so that the losses vary. It's between about 7,000 or 8,000 a year, and more recent numbers. Police obviously get targeted as well, but much smaller numbers. You're doing not less than 1,000. It's sort of the hundreds each year. But police are specifically getting targeted mainly by kind of gangsters, and you're getting police stations, sort of smaller, under-resourced policing areas that get targeted for their firearms. And you also see corruption where you sort of the sub 13 stores, individuals who have access to that are being offered bribes to provide firearms to certain groups. So it's not only civilians, it's police, but also private security, and to a much smaller degree the military as well.
Yeah. What is known about once there is an amnesty that that the police would call on and people then taking their firearms to the various police stations? Are we sure that when we look at the inventory that all of those firearms that have been handed over through the amnesty process have all been destroyed?
Well, I mean, there is a kind of a loss of confidence in the police around this because we've had a series of cases. I mean, we look, for example, at the Christian Prinsloo case where you saw more than 2,000 firearms that were surrendered to police, supposed to be destroyed. On the system it said it was destroyed, but those firearms were then, sold on to gangsters. We've seen a few other cases, such as police stations in Norwood, for example, and Mitchell's Plain, where firearms have been handed in, and then some of those firearms found their way into the hands of criminals. So, of course, the system, generally, most of those firearms will be destroyed, but there are leakages. And I mean, the police still need to do quite a bit of work to ensure that those leakages don't happen.
Yep. What's the answer then to South Africa's gun violence? Also considering, for instance, what's happening in KwaZulu-Natal, looking at some of the hits coming out of that province, and then also the Western Cape as well, which has been a hub for gangsters.
Well, there's a few things immediately, and then the police are doing some of these things. I mean, the one is through its high-density operations, focusing on illegal firearms, targeting the areas where illegal firearms are in use. It's going after those kind of groups who are using those particular firearms. So kind of, focusing on arresting those individuals using, if they're organized criminal groups such as gangs, using the Prevention of Organized Crime Act to kind of go after the money to try and shut them down that way. But a big problem which we haven't had much success on is dealing with illegal ammunition, because, I mean, guns are less potent if they don't have ammunition. But criminals seem to be having unlimited access to ammunition at the moment. So it's certainly something as a country we need to be focusing on.
Yeah. And then, of course, we know that on the continent, one of the stories that we reported a lot on during the 90s leading into the early 2000s was around recruiting of young children and grooming them as well by armed forces and armed groups. We've seen what's happening in KwaZulu-Natal as well, where young kids are being groomed. What sort of intervention should we see at that particular level? Because there's also the difficulty and the fear of some people that these children could actually form part of terrorist groups at some point.
I mean, within South Africa and many other sort of you've got different contexts, really. And in the case of armed conflicts, you have seen child soldiers in the past being recruited by rebel groups, insurgent groups, extremist groups, and, kind of going through a process of recruiting them and sort of almost kind of brainwashing them to engage in violence. So we see that in Sierra Leone, we've seen that within the Eastern Congo. More of a problem certainly is in the cities where young children, adolescents are being recruited into gangs. And so hence, perpetrating violence when they're part of those gangs. And the interventions that do tend to work is around having, really good developmental programs, youth programs, job creation programs in these places, but provides alternatives, because many of these young people that are joining these sort of gangs, coming from either, they kind of don't have family scenarios, they're kind of living on the street, or they've kind of dropped out of school, coming from broken families. So it's a sense of really working in communities and providing interventions in those communities, which is the only realistic way of dealing with this issue.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Guy Lemb, the criminologist from the Stellenbosch University. We're going